The next one I wanted to talk about was the relationship between cognition and values. Because I think there is an interesting relationship here where clearly cognition is, again, necessary but not sufficient for our values, for the evolution of our values. However, it seems like a person can adopt values that are sort of over their own heads. And we see this a lot in the conversations we've been having recently, particularly around the regression that we're seeing on the political left. A lot of whom they would describe themselves as champions of postmodern values. And they would even describe them as healthy postmodern values. But their cognition, again, they're clearly not capable of showing us the math in terms of how these values emerged in the first place. So it's almost like you grow up in a culture that has all of these values-based slogans. You start taking those slogans on, but the way you enact those slogans is obviously going to be based on your cognitive level of development. So all you need at love means something very different at amber than it does at green than it does at turquoise.
Yep.
So I guess my question here is can this help with our development? In other words, for a lot of these people who are on the left, who are espousing values that they themselves are not enacting properly because they do not yet have the cognitive development to enact them properly, will holding on to those values actually in some way help accelerate their development? Because it's like, we talk about ladder climber view. This is a climber that sort of has one hand on a higher rung. And even though he doesn't even know where his hand is yet, and he can't see that rung, he doesn't have the cognition to see that rung, still it seems like there might be a little bit of leverage gained there. Or is this purely like, no, in fact, you might choose completely different signifiers to represent your values once your cognition actually does transform?
Well, part of the confusion of in the culture wars with the extreme green, particularly in the far left, extreme left manifestation of that, one of the major ways that it gets its overall value structure is not that it's cognitively green and then self-related lines are green. That was the ideal. That's where it started out. That was what the best of the 60s was doing. Mm-hmm. The problem is that as that green became more extremist and more absolutistic in its orientation, and then its believers became more and more zealous and almost fundamentalist in their orientation. Remember, Clare Graves referred to the upper three stages in first tier. Amber he called absolutistic. And then because it had one perspective and that was the one correct way to see things and there were no exceptions. And if you disagree with that, you're going to burn in hell and all of those things. And they were all ethnocentric. So they were racist, sexist, and so on. And people that are down there today really are people like white supremacists, neo-Nazis, KKK. That really is amber ethnocentric. That's what it looks like. And by the way, they don't mind being called racist. I mean, they're saying, yes, that's what I'm doing. Right? What's the problem? The only people that get upset by being called racist are people who aren't racist. And that's what makes so much of the far left critique so idiotic. But the difficulty is that even if they start out at that green, and as green becomes sort of increasingly broken and extremist, and they become more and more zealous and absolutistic in their belief, they actually end up regressing to the absolutistic stage because that's where that value feels right, is down there at that actual rung of their own development. Now, they don't lose their cognitive capacity when that happens. Their talk is still green. And they're still mouthing all of those slogans, but they're living them from an amber ethnocentric stage. So they're value now, so now they've retribalized. And it's my tribe is the tribe that has the one absolutistically correct way to see this. So much so, I don't even have to talk to anybody else because I know what I'm saying is right and I can't possibly not be right. And there's no reason to even talk about it. And the fact that you don't agree with me, I don't have to argue the merit of it. Is if you disagree with me, I know categorically you're wrong, you're immoral, you're evil, and you're wicked. And if I have my right, I'll shut you down. And you disagreeing with me is an attack. It's a microaggression. It's a form of violence on me. And if you do that, I have the right to attack you first. I have the right to shut you down, to hit you, to stone your building, to spray mace in your face, whatever the violence of Antifa and the far left is. And they think that's absolutely justified because they're retribalized, they've regressed to ethnocentric, absolutistic amber. And even social commentators who don't have an understanding of developmental stages, they intuitively understand what's happening. They actually call these folks the regressive left. And they have regressed. But again, only in their walk, self-related lines. Cognitively, they still have a green capacity. So they still talk that lingo, but they're not living at that. They are coming straight out of that retribalized amber ethnocentric. And so what they find down there at amber is all of their roommates are the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, the regressive left, the far left, absolutely. And they're all down there in the same retribalized, ethnocentric warfare. And that's why the culture wars have become so unbelievably polarized, is at that ethnocentric stage, there's no world-centric commonalities. When you talk about, oh, you have to be identity politics, you are just a woman, or you are just a black person, or you are just gay. And when you talk about your tribe, if you're talking about you're a woman, then you have to say why your tribe is different from all the other tribes. So you spend all your time explaining why your tribe is different. You don't spend your time saying what your tribe has in common with other tribes. It's just how your tribe is different from other tribes. That is a prescription for social disintegration. That is retribalization. There's no world-centric aspects to it at all. And so we stop working for a common culture, a common society, where yes, we have diversity, but it's a unity in diversity. If it's just diversity, then you're one tribe, you're another tribe, you're another tribe, and we're at each other's throats. And the only end point of that is a literal civil war. Right now, we've got the most highly polarized political culture since we began testing polarization. It's never, ever been higher. It's alarming, and it's getting worse.
Yeah. So what about for someone who, for example, is just getting into your work, Ken? And let's say that this person cognitively is at an exit orange stage of their development. So they're gonna be hitting green soon. So there's some stuff that you write about that clearly goes way over their head. There's other stuff that you write that really resonates with them, at least at on the level that they're at. And they get, for whatever reason, turned on by some of these integral values that we talk about a lot. They get turned on by the idea of everyone is right, or the greatest depth for the greatest span, or any of these sort of heuristics that we often use to describe integral values, teal values, turquoise values. So obviously, someone who's at exit orange, who likes the idea of everyone is right, is going to enact that very differently. They're gonna, maybe, for example, they might enact that, well, okay, all third-person descriptions of reality are right, and I want to find a way to organize all those, but I'm still leaving out first person, I'm still leaving out second person, as an example of just how that can get enacted. I guess what I'm wondering is just having that phrase kind of rumbling around in the back of their heads, is that enough to give them the additional leverage they need to grow into that value at a somewhat accelerated rate? I mean, it's still going to be 5, 10 years, whatever the average is to go through, you know, these stages of development. But it feels like having your hands on some sort of telos. It seems like there is some element of these signifiers that can exert a telos-like pressure upon our development, because we're cognizing these very advanced values. I can think of how I enact these words today and how different it is from when I enacted them when I was 19 years old. And I can feel how much of my own development and growth and awakening is represented in that, you know, in those two different sets of enactments.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is that you can get a telos chaotic attractor that actually can be a very complex mixture of factors. And so I could set it up by saying that if we look at the general culture wars today, and we look at orange and green, green represents sort of the original liberal values. And these were world-centric. All people were to be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. There was an emphasis on individual rights and individual freedom for people. And the whole point is that you were not supposed to be judged based on any group that you were part of, because the whole definition of prejudice is that even if a group had certain values that some of them weren't really highly developed or highly skilled, nonetheless, just because you were generically part of that group, and if you met a person that was part of that group, let's say a group of purple men and purple women, and they were known for not having a high IQ, and you met a purple person, you're not being purple racist to say that objectively, when we measure purple IQ, it has an average score of, 82, something like that. What's prejudiced or bigoted is if you meet that purple person and without getting to know them at all or find out about who they are, you simply assume that they have that low IQ. That's prejudice. That's bigotry. That's what you're not allowed to do. And that's what the orange, world-centric revolutionary freedom movements did, which started to extend rights and freedoms to all people, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. The whole point was you're not allowed to judge somebody based on some group characteristic, particularly ones that are immutable. If you can't change your skin color, why in God's name does that become a defining factor of whether you have character? You have no choice over that. You can't build character, but you can't change your skin color. It's like saying, well, you have to be at least 5'10" in order to be considered a good person. That's not allowed. You're not allowed to judge a person based on immutable characteristics over which they have no control. That was what the Western Enlightenment got rid of. That's what these universal rights and freedoms brought. That's why we ended slavery with that period alone. It had never been ended before. So right now, and there are unhealthy versions of that as well, things can go wrong on that. But today, in the culture wars, those orange liberal values are relatively healthy. What's not healthy are green. Green started healthy, it got extremist, and it's pretty badly broken today. And then amber itself has some healthy versions. A lot of them are also broken and extremist, and they really are white supremacists or neo-Nazis or KKK and so on. So if we look at orange and green, here's the choice. And notice these are two very different factors, but they go together. It's a choice between a lower level that's healthy versus a higher level that's sick. and those go together.
Mm.
So if there is a telos for this development, that's what you're getting pulled to, a higher sickness. And that's the actual inherent drive now, that development is going to show up in that culture. That's what it's doing. And that's what gets frightening, because we really are producing increasingly broken extremist green. And it's completely dominated the campuses, so much so that it's absolutely driven out any conservative view from the humanities entirely. I mean, people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt will say, well, in the humanities, psychology, sociology, human sciences, there are no conservative thinkers at all, none. In 1960, the ratio of liberal to conservative professors was about 4-1. Now it's about 30-1, which means there are no conservatives. I mean, that's about as broken as you can get. And of course, I'm not just a conservative. I believe they have to be integrated. But it's disastrous when higher education is no longer education; it's an indoctrination into an ideology.
Right.
And that's as badly broken as you can get.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's out of the campuses that future culture comes, and that's where it's headed right now. And that's absolutely catastrophic. So it's also pretty interesting that with this whole thing called the intellectual dark web, every single one of those, even though they will actually associate themselves with either the left or the right, and there are people across that entire spectrum, from very, very strongly right, like Ben Shapiro, to very, very strongly left, like the Weinstein brothers, that every single one of them has used this identical phrase to define their political orientation, including Jordan Peterson, including Charles Murray, including the Weinstein brothers, including Ben Shapiro. They say, I am, quote, a classic liberal. That means they are representing orange, world-centric liberal values, because those are the ones that aren't getting included. Those are the ones that are completely broken when it comes to green, and they're just absent at amber because you haven't moved up to them yet. And so that's the nightmare. And the entire intellectual dark web, not one of them, literally not one of them, has ever been invited to an organization that was left. They're only getting invitations from organizations that are right oriented. And so that's just astonishing. That's an example of how badly broken the cultural leading edge is. That's and unfortunately, that's the telos that we're offering to our young up and coming generation. And it's truly culturally nightmarish.
Yeah, it really is. And Warren Farrell has similar experiences where, he's like, look, I'm a pretty left-leaning dude, know, and yet when I talk to liberals about my work here, it's just like either get mad at me or they're just completely apathetic.
Right.
I go to conservative audiences and show them this work, and they get, really much more excited about it.
Right.
So it is a big problem.
One of the things that people have a very hard time understanding now, and it's actually confused pretty much everybody who considers himself a liberal or on the left, and that is up until the 60s and into the 70s, to be left meant to be orange. And you were for those original liberal values, you were for individual rights and freedom and fairness across the board. And when kids grew up, particularly boomers, the best and the brightest were liberals, because to be conservative and traditional, those were the ones that were still kind of supporting racist, segregated culture, and fairly patriarchal in terms of orientation to women and stuff like that. And so if you were at all evolved and advanced at that period, you were orange and you were a left liberal. And that's what the left meant to you. And so it had a moral weight to it. And then as green started to emerge, And we moved from these orange universal rights, treating everybody fairly, where freedom was emphasized as equal opportunity. Then this moved into a relativistic stage, what Grace called the relativistic stage. And now instead of just saying, oh, there's this one basically better way of viewing things, now it was, no, wait, other cultures have truths. Those deserve to be included. We need to take those into account. So we got this multicultural view where diversity is our strength. The problem is they could differentiate all those different cultural views and truths and values, but they couldn't integrate them. They didn't have enough cognitive strength to do that. They could differentiate them, but not yet integrate them. That wouldn't happen until second tier. So in the meantime, all Green was sure of is it because it believed in equity, not so much freedom, but equality. And it absolutized equality the more it got absolutistic in its own orientation. So the one thing it was sure of is that if you look at all the different groups that are out there, race, sex, gender, creed, whatever they were, they all had equal value. That goes without saying. Therefore, they all should be exactly the same in terms of their accomplishments. And if you find any group accomplishing more than another group, it's because that group is oppressing that group. That's the only cause. And so all of a sudden, because they absolutized that equality value, then they started devaluing freedom. So free speech, and that's not important anymore. As a matter of fact, you're allowed to interrupt freedom in order to get equality. And you actually have to oppress freedom to get equality. So Alex de Tocqueville first pointed out that because humans are born with differences, then you can either have freedom or you can have equality. You can't have both.
Right.
And that's right. If you're going to have absolute equality, then you have to erase freedom. I mean, if you're going to have, let's say, absolute equality in the NBA, then you're going to have all races absolutely equally represented in basketball teams. So you're going to have the same number of Jews that are represented, same number of Muslims represented, same number of blacks represented. And in order to do that, you're going to have to curtail freedom because some of those groups are better at it than other groups, and you're going to have to deny them freedom to actually compete. So you're going to have some sort of quota system, and that's going to interrupt freedom. So
Right.
that's gone. And if you have freedom, though, you won't have equality because people have, and among other things, just different interests.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to want to do different things. And so there's not going to be equal outcome, which is what Green wants. And what nobody understands is because the original left-ish political orientation was orange, and then this new green value system developed, and progressives, leading edge progressives, moved into green, then we had two branches of the Democratic Party, and they violently disagreed with each other. And one were the old liberal original Democrats that believed in freedom and equal individual rights. And then you had the new postmodern green, and they were Democrats that believed in group identity and identity politics and group rights. They wanted absolute equality, not freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where many of the people that were brought up in the original left, that was for freedom and equal rights and all that, they kept saying, I don't know what happened to the Democratic Party, but I can't believe that anymore. These guys have lost their bloody minds. And so you actually have very famous, like videotapes, Dave Rubin, why I'm no longer a member of the left. Because what had happened, when the left was calling itself this far left, extreme, green, multicultural diversity, equal outcome, or equity for everybody, that's what original liberals saw as absolutely anti-liberal. And it was. There were books written on the liberal left. And it was shocking to people because they couldn't understand what happened, how that drastic change occurred. And that's why now there's so many people that saying, I didn't leave the Democrats, they left me. I have no idea what these people are doing, but they're insane. And you can look at almost all 20 of the Democratic frontrunners right now, and they have these extreme far left, in many cases over the wall types of programs and beliefs, and it's just insane.
Yeah.
And one of them are liberal.
Yeah. Ken, my sense is like, I think probably 80% of this country would probably be described as moderates. And this group, which is like the majority of us, are looking at both of these political parties that are running as quickly to their extreme limits as they possibly can.
Yep.
And I think this 80% who's actually in the middle, who actually represent the real political will of this country, are just like, what the fuck is happening to my country?
That's right.
Why is there no place for me? It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.